The case of John Reginald Halliday Christie is considered one of the most infamous criminal cases dating from 1950s Britain. The case is notorious for three reasons. Firstly, the gruesome nature of the murders, with bodies stowed via various methods around the now infamous address of 10 Rillington Place. And secondly, the evidence that post-mortem sex was inflicted on the corpses for several days after the murder took place. And thirdly, the discovery of 6 bodies in and around the household led to the likely probability that an innocent man, Timothy Evans, had been hanged 3 years earlier for 2 more of Christie's murders, those of Evans' own wife and baby daughter. Others have suggested that there could have been 2 separate murderers living in the same shared house simultaneously. Mr. Justice Brabin stated in 1966 that it was more probable than not that Evans killed his wife, but that he did not kill his daughter Geraldine. While neither Christie nor Evans' innocence or guilt concerning these particular crimes have ever been conclusively proven, the case sparked massive public outrage and contributed to the suspension of the death penalty in Britain in 1965. John Reginald Halliday Christie was born in Yorkshire, England in 1898. His father had been a severe man who whipped his children whenever he felt like it. He also made them take long walks in a marching style. Because his father despised his son's frailty, his mother held him close. He was her favourite. She emasculated him with overprotection. His 4 older sisters reinforced this feminine influence, but they dominated him. Christie retreated inside himself. Although he learned to exaggerate symptoms of poor health to attract attention, he also developed a horror of dirt. Christie never made friends in any lasting way, although he did well in school and seemed to fit in. He participated in church activities, including becoming part of the choir. He also played sports and became a scoutmaster. He liked in particular the donning of his uniform. When he was 8, his maternal grandfather died. Christie was asked if he wanted to see the body, which was laid out for a wake. He said that he did, and when he went to look at the man who had previously frightened him so much, he experienced sudden pleasure at the release of tension that overwhelmed him. This episode fascinated him. Around this time he began to play in the graveyard and seemed especially drawn to a damaged vault that housed children's remains. He liked to peer inside through the cracks at the mouldering coffins. This morbid obsession with death remained with him throughout his life. Sexually, he was inhibited. He had first been sexually aroused and disturbed at the age of 10 by seeing one of his older sister's legs, a sister he resented. In Christie's case, it exaggerated an already tense situation. He had always resented his sisters bossing him about, and now, to add salt to his wounds, he found himself physically attracted to them. He both loved and hated them because they aroused his masculinity and then stifled it. And this went on day after day, month after month, year after year. There must have been many occasions when he thought of his grandfather and wished them all dead. While with other boys he boasted that he was popular with the opposite sex, his attempts at clumsy sexual intercourse with the local girls failed miserably, and he soon earned the nicknames Can't Make It Christie and Reggie No Dick. Christie developed a deep hatred of women, especially those who tempted him, because he knew he could not satisfy them. He also feared them, and these feelings merged into a repressed and murderous rage. Leaving school at the age of 15, he found work as a projectionist in a local cinema. Then World War I arrived and he entered the service as a signalman, becoming quite good at detailed work. He saw action once when a mustard gas shell knocked him unconscious and temporarily blinded him, although there is no record of this incident of blindness in existence. He also lost his voice and remained silent for over 3 years. Physicians determined this to be an hysterical reaction rather than a real physical malady. Quite simply, he was afraid. After that, he exaggerated illness to avoid unpleasant situations. He left the army and returned to his job. Then he became a clerk. In 1920 he married Ethel Simpson Waddington, despite being for the large part mute. Fulfilling his marital duties was misery for Christie, and even the very passive Ethel couldn't help him overcome his sexual difficulties. Christie had been frequenting prostitutes since the age of 19. Although these women made no demands, they nevertheless humiliated him by reminding him of his inability with regular women. Yet, even after he was married, he continued to consort with them and pay for a needed sexual release and for the feeling of being in control. Whether or not the normal sex act was achieved with these women is not known, but considering his previous history, it is unlikely. Early in their marriage, Christie became a postman, but after stealing some postal orders, he was sent to prison for 3 months. After being released, his voice suddenly returned while having a temper tantrum. Then, just as quickly, he lost it again, but after 6 months of silence, he was once again able to speak. At the age of 25, he was put on probation at the post office for charges of violence. Also, stories circulated that he was frequenting prostitutes. Around this time he left his wife and went to London. She remained in Sheffield and got a job as a typist. Four years later, Christie was in prison again, this time for 9 months on 2 charges of theft. Afterwards, he drifted through a series of jobs and started living with a prostitute. During an argument, he hit her over the head with a cricket bat and was sent to prison for another 6 months. He was also suspected of violence against other women, but lack of evidence meant no further inquiries were made. His life was still without direction when he got out, and a few years later he was arrested again when he stole a car from a priest who tried to help him. He then asked Ethel to come and live with him after he came out of prison. After being separated for almost 10 years, Ethel rejoined her husband in London in 1933. She was now 35, lonely and desperate to have a stable home, but she had no idea what kind of person she was about to move in with. There had been some significant changes in Christie's emotional state since they were last together. Suddenly, World War II broke out, and Christie immediately signed up as a volunteer member of the War Reserve Police. They made no inquiries about his past record, which would surely have barred him from service, and he proudly received his uniform as a special constable for Harrow Road Police Station. He remained there for 4 years, probably the happiest of his life. Finally, having some sense of purpose, he became almost fanatical about upholding the law, and he enjoyed the authority it gave him, and he loved wearing the uniform. He also used the position to follow women, the notes of which he kept for many years. To spy on his neighbours, he bored a peephole in his kitchen door. Once a crime was spotted, he would berate the bewildered transgressor at great length, no matter how petty the incident. Christie's first known victim was killed sometime in 1943. Ruth Thirst was a 21-year-old Austrian girl who was having an affair with Christie when he impulsively strangled her during sex. He then buried her in the communal garden at Rillington Place. Excited by the ultimate power thrill that the death of his victim had afforded, he took great care in planning his next attack. His 32-year-old neighbour, Muriel Oddie. On November the 8th, 1944, he invited her over. After serving her a nice cup of tea and biscuits, he claimed that he was able to cure a recurring chest ailment with a special inhaler which actually contained carbon monoxide. Once she was rendered unconscious, he strangled her while raping her, and she died during the process. She too joined Ruth Thirst in the back garden.
Well, we'll have a nice little cup of tea first. Come in the kitchen, it's cosier in there. Well, this is the stuff for you, Muriel. You don't mind if I call you Muriel, do you? No.
In the spring of 1948, 10 years after the Christies had first begun to live there, Timothy Evans and his wife Beryl moved into the top flat. They had been married less than a year and they were expecting their first baby. Beryl was 19 and petite, her husband 24. He drove a van for a living and could barely read. Born in a mining town called Merthyr Vale in South Wales, he was abandoned by his father before he was even born. As a child, he had suffered from uncontrollable tantrums. When he failed to get along with his mother, who had remarried a man named Probert, he was shunted off to his grandmother, who could not keep him in school. Evans was known as a habitual liar, prone to self-aggrandizing fantasies, and with an IQ of around 70, borderline retarded. Having suffered an injury to his foot that put him into the hospital numerous times, he ended up receiving very little education. Evan's sister Eileen found the flat for them and helped them to furnish and decorate it. Her memory of their neighbour, Mr. Christie, indicates that he may have had dangerous intentions towards her. He came into the flat one day without her hearing him and suddenly appeared at her side with a cup of tea. She declined it, but he made no move to leave. Finally, she told him her brother would soon be back, and he left as suddenly as he had come in. She would later learn what sharing tea with women meant to him. When the baby arrived, the couple named her Geraldine. Her birth put a strain on the marriage, since Timothy's meagre wages could not quite cover the bills. In addition, Beryl turned out to be a poor housekeeper and cook. She even neglected the baby at times. They had arguments frequently, and physical violence was not uncommon. In debt and unable to get along, Timothy and Beryl's relationship became more and more strained. She allegedly told Mrs. Christie that Timothy had attempted to strangle her. To her horror, Beryl soon discovered she was pregnant again. She blamed her husband entirely for this. Beryl tried to take some pills and use douches to be rid of the baby, but Timothy could not see what all the fuss was about. He could not understand that Beryl wanted to continue to work part-time so they could pay their mounting bills. She was determined to seek an abortion, and she told everyone about it, including Mr. Christie. Christie claimed that he had some knowledge of abortion, illegal in the UK at that time, and offered to assist the couple. Beryl became Christie's third victim. She was killed on November the 8th, 1948, incapacitated, strangled and violated as per his modus operandi. He persuaded Evans that her death had resulted from septic poisoning from the various other abortion remedies that she had tried up until that point, and convinced him not to go to the police. Instead, he was dispatched alone to stay with his mother's sister in Wales, with Christie claiming that he had found a young couple willing to look after the baby Geraldine. She was never seen alive again. Evan's mother, puzzled by the mysterious disappearance of Beryl and the baby, confronted Evans and, on November the 30th, unable to maintain the charade any longer, he turned himself in to the local police station in Wales. Wishing to protect Christie, he confessed to accidentally killing Beryl himself by giving her abortion pills and then disposing of her body in a sewer drain. Police in Notting Hill duly investigated and found nothing, and Evans was questioned more intensely a second time, at which time he changed his story and implicated Christie in Beryl's death. When Beryl and the baby could not be located, the police searched the house thoroughly. They went through to the backyard and tried to get into the wash house, but the door was stuck fast. Mrs. Christie helpfully provided them with a piece of metal to loosen it. They noticed some wood standing against the sink. One of the officers reached behind it and felt something. They moved the wood and saw what appeared to be a package wrapped in green tablecloth and tied up with cord. Mrs. Christie claimed she had never seen it before and did not know what it was. They pulled the package out further and untied the cord. A pair of feet slipped out, revealing the decomposing body of Beryl Evans. After a further search, they found Geraldine lying under some wood behind the door. Both had been strangled. A man's tie was still around the baby's neck. Further questioning caused Evans to change his story a number of times, which included a confession to having strangled Beryl over mounting debts. But this may have been due to the limitations of his mental abilities and the strenuous police interrogation. Christie was also questioned, but managed to convince police that he had no involvement. With careful coaching from Christie, his wife Ethel also corroborated his version. Evans went on trial on January the 11th, 1950, and his ineffective defense team failed to follow up on a number of inconsistencies in the testimony offered by Christie and his wife. Indeed, Christie was a key witness for the prosecution, and his positive impression on the jury was instrumental in Evans being found guilty. Evans continued to maintain his innocence and attempted one appeal, but after that was rejected, he went quietly to the gallows on March the 9th, 1950. Following the trial, Christie's hypochondria grew steadily worse, and he became depressed and lost a considerable amount of weight. He lost his job at the post office and found it difficult to maintain a job over the next few years. Around December the 12th, 1952, Ethel Christie disappeared mysteriously, and Christie informed neighbours that she'd gone back to Sheffield, while relatives were told she had become too ill to communicate with them. Although he continued to send gifts marked as coming from the both of them, Ethel was in fact already dead, strangled and quietly rotting under the floorboards in their parlour. To combat the smell of decay, Christie began liberally dousing the entire house with strong disinfectants, because the other tenants were starting to remark on the increasingly vile odours that were coming from Christie's flat. Christie's next victim was 25-year-old Rita Nelson, a pregnant prostitute who was persuaded by Christie that he could assist her with a termination, and who suffered the same fate as Beryl Evans on January the 19th, 1953. Her body was placed in an alcove that existed behind a cupboard in the kitchen. 26-year-old Kathleen Maloney, another prostitute, was gassed, strangled and raped post-mortem in February 1953. And in the morning, after Christie woke up and had his cup of tea, she joined Nelson in the alcove behind the cupboard. Christie's final victim, 26-year-old Hectorina McLennan, was also gassed, strangled and her body violated after death, then also stashed in the alcove. Christie then papered over the cupboard and concealed the alcove, but could do very little about the increasingly vile smell coming from the three decomposing bodies. One day he noticed a woman, Mrs. Riley, looking for a place to rent and invited her to look at his. She brought her husband, which Christie had not anticipated. They decided to take the flat, paying 3 months' rent in advance. Christie borrowed a suitcase from them and moved out on March the 20th. He had his dog destroyed but left his cat with the new tenants. The Rileys were not in the flat even one day when they learned from the real landlord that Christie had no right to rent the flat. They were asked to leave. Both they and the landlord were out on the rent money, but since the place smelled so bad, they were more than happy to vacate. Christie himself was on the move. He did not wish to be around when certain discoveries were made. The landlord now had an empty flat, so he allowed the upstairs tenant, Beresford Brown, to use the kitchen. Brown noticed a bad smell, so he began to clean things up. It then occurred to him that he might install a new shelf on the wall for his wireless radio. He began to knock on the walls to find the proper place to drill holes, and discovered one that sounded hollow. He assumed there was a cupboard behind it. Brown pulled away some of the wallpaper. He was pleased to see that there was a door, but it couldn't be budged. He shone a light through the crack and then stepped back, uncertain that he had seen what he thought he had seen. It looked to him as if a naked woman were inside that wall. All he could see was her back. He contacted the police. Chief Superintendent Peter Beveridge attended to the matter. Several officers arrived at Rillington Place along with the coroner. Chief Inspector Percy Law of Scotland Yard was also among them, as was a pathologist. When the door was opened, they all saw the corpse of a woman sitting amid some rubble. She was leaning forward, her back to them. Stalactites of sperm emerging from the victim's vagina confirmed later after tests that post-mortem sex had occurred for several days after the murder. Behind her was something equally large, wrapped in a blanket. The blanket was knotted to the victim's bra, which was pulled up high towards her neck. Otherwise, she wore only a garter belt and stockings. Her black sweater and white jacket were pulled up high around her neck. She was removed and taken to the front room for a photograph and examination. It was soon clear that she had been strangled with a ligature. Her wrists were tied in front of her with a handkerchief that had been wrapped in a special knot known as a reef knot. The body was fairly well preserved. Next, the police focused on the other object in the cupboard. As they photographed it, they noticed another tall, wrapped object just beyond it. They pulled out the one which was blocking access and soon discovered that it was another body. It had been stood on its head in the cupboard and propped like that against the wall. The blanket had been fastened with a sock into a reef knot around the ankles, and the head was wrapped in a pillowcase also tied into a reef knot with a stocking. The third object was yet another corpse. This one was also upside down, with her head beneath the second body. Her ankles were tied with an electrical cord using a reef knot. A cloth covered the head and was also knotted in the same fashion. Police had also searched the garden. They noticed the human femur this time, in plain view supporting the wooden fence. More bones were found in flower beds and some blackened skull bones with teeth and pieces of a dress turned up in a dustbin. Bones were also found beneath an orange blossom bush. Nearby was a newspaper fragment dated July the 19th, 1943. A quantity of collected hair was discovered along with some teeth. They determined that although only one skull was found, there were 2 female corpses in the garden. That made a total of 6 bodies found at Rillington Place. The hunt for Christie began. Having run out of money and hungry, he rang a newspaper offering an exclusive story in return for a cooked full English breakfast and a change of clothing. The meeting went awry when, by pure coincidence, 2 policemen happened to walk by. Thinking he had been betrayed, Christie fled the scene. He was finally apprehended on March 31st, 1953. He made statements about 4 of the murders willingly, but had explanations for all. His wife's had been a mercy killing, she had been choking to death anyway when he strangled her, and the 3 prostitutes had been aggressive and taken advantage of him, driving him to defend himself. His confessions were riddled with lies and evasions. When confronted with the evidence of the garden corpses, he admitted those murders too, and at one point also admitted to the murder of Beryl Evans, although he described it again as a mercy killing.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
The next day he was charged with his wife's murder. On April the 15th he was charged with murdering the 3 prostitutes. While in prison, Christie confessed to murdering all the women found in the cellar as well as Beryl Evans. He never admitted to killing Geraldine Evans. Particular attention to the fact that Christie became most indignant at any suggestions as to how the victims died other than those he had described to police. Dr. Hobson for the defense stated, "These tricks of memory or avoidance of getting down to disturbing topics is to preserve his own self-respect, rather than avoid incriminating himself." For the prosecution, Dr. Matheson testified that on the contrary, Christie was not suffering from hysteria, but rather he was an hysterical personality who only became vague when questioned as to incriminating facts. These findings were further corroborated by a psychiatrist who testified that Christie was an inadequate personality with hysterical features. Christie's trial began on June 22, 1953, in the same court where Evans had been tried. He was on trial solely for the murder of his wife. Christie pleaded insanity and claimed to have a poor memory of the events. The jury rejected the plea and after 22 minutes found him guilty of murdering his wife. On June 29th, Christie said he would not appeal against the death sentence. Fife said on July 13th that he would not grant a reprieve because there was no physical or psychological grounds for doing so. Some MPs tried to postpone the execution so that Christie could talk more about the earlier murders, but this was not granted. Christie himself refused in the final days of his life to meet MPs in his cell. He was hanged by Albert Pierpoint at Pentonville Prison, on the same gallows as Timothy Evans 3 years earlier. Well, my dear audience, I hope you enjoyed that presentation, and I will have a nice cup of tea now. You go and sit down there by the fire in my easy chair, and I'll bring some lovely jam-filled biscuits too. Go on, just there. Aye. Sorry about that. Couldn't resist that impersonation of Christie. Yeah, the house and Rillington Place was demolished in the 1970s. They wanted to erase all memory of his heinous crimes, and also, to rebuild. The houses were terribly and poorly made, and they decided to update Notting Hill. The man who lives in the spot where the house next door to 10 Rillington Place would have stood. He reckons the place is cursed even today, the area, or the area right near Rillington Place. He thinks it's bad luck and lots of things go wrong in the house. He's been there 40 years. Says his health has suffered because of it. Whether it has anything to do with the energies surrounding that site, I don't know. I'll leave that for you to guess. Yeah, so it doesn't stand anymore, the house or the street, and the area is quite upmarket, I believe, nowadays. Not back then. Yeah, this case was fascinating for my parents. They lived in that era and they were in the grip of that whole story, as well as the rest of Great Britain. And I remember when they took me to Madame Tussauds when I was a child in London, and we went to the Chamber of Horrors. And there were a few exhibits that really got my imagination firing, and the John Christie exhibit was really one of them that stuck in my memory the most. And I do have an image of it right at the end of this video. You'll see I was quite fascinated by the badly plastered and wallpapered wall. In my childish imagination, I was thinking, is there something behind there? Refusing to believe it's just a wax exhibit, refusing to believe it was just an exhibit. That's what kids' imaginations are like. But the case did stand out in my memory, and one of my dear patrons here suggested I do the case, and that's exactly what I did. And I hope you enjoyed it. It was a hell of a lot of work. But I wanted to give you the best. So, I hope you enjoy it. Leave some comments. Thumb up. You can even thumb up on Patreon. It's just like YouTube. So, yes, here's the image in question. It's been up for a few seconds now. So you can see it had quite an impact on me. There he's standing there with his wallpaper paste, and the wall behind him very badly done, plastered and wallpapered. And I actually still have this souvenir prospect that I got as a kid. I think it was about 1975. I still have it. Being the hoarder that I am, I can't let go of things like that. And it's good to look back on things like this and remember. And I asked my dad, who's very old, 93, if he remembers going with us that day, and he did. He remembered the exhibits too, and the Chamber of Horrors, and the Christie exhibit. So I just thought I would show you that. I thought you might find it interesting. I don't know if it's still there today. If anyone out there has been to Madame Tussauds recently, can they let me know whether there is a John Christie exhibit? If this one still exists, I doubt it very much. Anyway, I will leave you with that, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'm sounding American now. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, my lovelies. How's that? That's better. Anyway, I think I've worked too hard. I'm going off now for a nice cup of tea. Take care, my friends, and until next time, bye-bye.